Let me begin by maybe bringing this question to Dr. Craig or Dr. Bach. Just a few minutes ago, we heard Dr. Schmidt talk about the fact that oftentimes we have an event, then we have the recording of the event, and from that point in time, it's the repeating of the record. And so I think what he was trying to imply, and certainly what I heard Dr. Borg saying, if Mark was written in the 70s, many of the other Gospels written in the 80s, and John written in the 90s, that there was enough time for embellishment, for other kinds of metaphorical discussions to take place. So either to Dr. Craig or Dr. Borg, I would like to give you a chance to respond to that and talk about how you would deal with that particular question.
Well, let me open up by saying that although my time frame for the authorship of these events is slightly tighter than the suggestion of 70s to 90s, I think we're probably looking at 60s or late 50s for Mark to 90s. I don't think that's the major point of issue. What we have between the various accounts in the Gospels, it seems to me, are reflections grounded in tradition. And I like to use this illustration. If you talk to my wife and I about our courtship, we don't always share the same details about what led up to our getting married. I may see certain things as important, she may see certain things as important. It isn't automatically the case that the mere nature of differences simply indicates that someone has created or embellished or told their story in a creatively fresh metaphorical way. It could simply be the fact that one person either recorded or recalled other elements about the event vis-a-vis another person. And the same can be true in the tradition. And we have clearly various strands working in the tradition. All people working in the New Testament recognize this. They're commonly isolated into four groupings when we talk about the synoptics: Mark, Q, M, and L. Mark for the material unique to Mark, Q for the teaching material shared between Matthew and Luke, M material unique to Matthew, L material, the material unique to Luke. So everyone is working with that, although when we come to the Passion material and the Easter material, there is also recognition among most New Testament scholars, and I don't think this is debated as conservative or liberal issue, that there is a history in that tradition of development that is somewhat distinct from what we see in the rest of the Synoptic Gospels. I make the point about those details simply to say that it's not merely the case that we have one account and someone comes along and says, you know what, I'm not happy with Mark, so I'm going to slap in some additions and say something more. I think the development of the tradition and the reflection of the tradition is more complex than that and has tradition strands that we have to take into account or are operating or in play.
Dr. Craig?
Well, I would just want to add to that. That was why in the cases I presented it, I kept trying to drive back to the sources behind the Gospels, to press these as early as possible. The source that Mark used for the burial and empty tomb narratives, the information Paul hands on in 1 Corinthians 15. By driving back behind these sources, or to these sources behind the New Testament documents, you close that window during which legend has opportunity to develop. And also, the four facts that I mentioned concern only the core of these narratives, not the secondary or circumstantial details. So it's quite consistent with what I shared, that you might have embellishment in the secondary circumstances of the narratives, but the historical core is preserved.
While we're talking about the historical narratives, maybe for Dr. Borg and Dr. Schmidt, as I understand, Dr. Craig was making a statement that at least the source for Mark could go all the way back to within, say, 7 years of the resurrection. If indeed you accepted that, how would that affect your view? It's a little difficult to imagine someone carrying on a story that 7 years ago during the Clinton administration that 5,000 were fed on the south lawn of the White House by a little boy's lunchbox. Can you respond?
A couple comments here. Again, a reflection of the different scholars we read. I must admit I have never read a scholar who has argued that Mark is using an early source that we can push back to within 10 years or so. And any reconstruction of a pre-Markan source for the Easter story is highly speculative. as speculative as anything you think I might have done tonight, okay? Okay. Second comment is this. I agree completely that if my wife and I shared our stories of our courtship, we would tell it slightly differently and all of that, but it wouldn't deny the fact that there was a courtship and a lot of this stuff happened. But with the story of the empty tomb, the issue, and again, I can't demonstrate one or the other of these, and I don't think you can either. The issue is not, do we have several different people remembering the empty tomb, or is the story of the empty tomb itself created as a parable of the resurrection? Now, when I say a parable of the resurrection, what I mean is, how do you say Jesus is not a figure of the past? Jesus is not in the land of the dead. One marvelous way you could do that is to tell a story about going to his tomb and they find the tomb empty. And in Mark's gospel, the message of the angel, and in biblical stories, almost always the function of an angel is to tell you what's going on in the narrative. The angel says, "He is not here, he is risen." That's what the story of the empty tomb as a parable of the resurrection would mean. You won't find Jesus in the land of the dead. He is a figure of the present, a living reality who continues to be known. And again, I want to underline, I think the only significant historical difference between me and Darrell and Bill is the empty tomb crucial? I realize that's a theological question too, but I think that's the big issue. So I'll just stop with that.
Darrell?
Just the remark about whether there are any scholars who push the tradition back. Raymond Brown's magisterial study on the death of Jesus about the empty tomb tradition tied to Joseph of Arimathea argues that it reflects a tradition that goes back a decade or 2 decades within the time.
I heard source as written source. Did I misunderstand when you said a source?
Are you saying that you don't think there was a pre-Markan Passion story?
I'm just asking for clarification. When you said source, I heard you to mean written source. Were you not saying written source?
It could be oral tradition, but
then that would change my saying I've never read a scholar who's argued that. Yeah.
Okay. Now, with regard to the other matter and the nature of the material, we are in total agreement that one of the key points of difference between us is the importance of whether or not the empty tomb was empty. That's the point of all the Jewish evidence that I brought forward. It was to say that if we created a story out of the historical background that we're talking about, we would not create an empty tomb story that ends with the note, "He is risen," because we don't get an individual raised by himself apart from the general resurrection of the end time in Judaism. There's no context to create that story. I'm arguing that that is an evidentiary basis for arguing that it is more plausible to think we have a historical account on our hands than we have, if I want to take your language seriously, than that we have poetry plus.
Just to clarify, you're saying they wouldn't use the language of resurrection unless the tomb were empty.
My point is to say they wouldn't create a story of the empty tomb that says he is risen without a category for which that makes sense, unless there was an event behind it.
But was my statement also okay? That you can't explain why they would use the language of resurrection unless the tomb was empty? Is that part of your argument?
That's part of my argument, yes.
Could I qualify that?
And then I'd like to give Dr. Schmidt an opportunity.
What you want to say is that they wouldn't have invented or wouldn't have believed in the resurrection unless they at least believed the tomb was empty.
What do you make of the statement raised to God's right hand?
Well, I think
that isn't dependent upon Jewish understandings of resurrection of the time.
Oh, that's true, but the question is, what kind of understanding existed of that language before we got to the time of Jesus? It's my recollection about Jewish understanding of these texts that they were applied to the possibility that some kingly figure of some kind would be given some position of authority at the time of the resurrection at the end. Okay, so we're still in the same cycle, if you will. Hezekiah, for example, is suggested in the Midrash to Psalm 110 as the referent for that text. So in Jewish thinking, we're still in the same world, and we are not where we are at with Jesus being raised.
Let me give Dr. Schmidt an opportunity to respond.
Two comments. One would be, again, the earliest account we have is Paul. Nowhere does Paul have any mention of a tomb. And while silence itself doesn't prove it couldn't have been, it surely suggests that is not the founding event that started this whole tradition. Paul knows nothing about a tomb. What Paul knows is the experience he had. And the paradigm Paul has to interpret that is his belief in the resurrection. Nowhere in Judaism does it talk about resurrection of the body.